There is a story they tell in Harrow Keep about the winter the wolves chose before their king did. They say the pups went first. 3 of them, gray as river stone and barely past their first molt, noses low to the frost-hardened mud, following a woman no one had bothered to name on any ledger that mattered. She had been assigned a cot in the eastern scullery, a wooden bowl she shared with 2 others, and a title that was not a title at all, the spare Omega from Dunfield, the one Lord Cresslin sent when his finer tribute fell ill. She walked through the keep with her eyes on the ground and her hands red from the washing tubs and her mouth shut, because she had learned long ago that a woman in her position spoke only when the cost of silence was higher than the cost of speaking. The pups followed her out the gate on a morning when the blood moon was still fading from the western sky, and King Aldrich was 3 steps behind before he knew why his feet were moving. He would not have an answer for that for many weeks. The audience watching from the upper corridors already knew. Stay close to this one, you will want to see what comes next. The year was 483 of the Harrow Reckoning, the 41st winter of Aldrich's rule, the 5th year of his silence on the question of a queen. The pack chroniclers called it the Long Cold for its record frost. The servants who worked through it called it something harder and kept it to themselves. Snow had packed into the courtyard flagstones so tight it turned to gray glass underfoot, and the wind off the northern ridgeline had a sound like iron dragged across stone. Winter in Harrow was not a season. It was an argument the land made every year about who deserved to stay. The woman's name was Senna. She had been 19 when the Alpha of Dunfield, a man with cold eyes and a precise signature, processed her transfer to the Harrow household in lieu of the settlement's annual quota. The paperwork listed her as sound of body, unranked in wolf status, possessing no secondary gifts. It was, in every meaningful particular, a lie, but the lie would take time to surface. She only knew that she had arrived at Harrow Keep with a bundle of her mother's things and been handed a scrubbing brush before the gate finished closing behind her. She was 23 now. 4 years had organized themselves quietly around her labor. She rose before the keep's fire tenders and went to sleep after the kitchen dogs had stopped whining, and she knew where every loose stone in the courtyard lay so she could cross it without a lantern. She knew which upper keep guard would take bread for news and which would report the exchange. She knew that the gray wolf who sometimes lay across the threshold of the king's east door was not a wolf at all, but the king's second, a man named Bren. She knew these things because she watched and was not watched in return. The 3 pups found her on the morning of the midwinter tithe. She had been carrying water from the inner well, 2 heavy pails balanced against the pull of the frozen slope, when the smallest pup pressed its nose into the back of her knee. She stopped. The water swayed. She looked down and found 3 pairs of pale amber eyes watching her with the flat, patient certainty of very young wolves who had already made up their minds. She said, "Go back inside." They did not go back inside. She said softer, "You'll freeze out here. The flagstones are like ice." She set down 1 pail and pressed her free hand briefly to the smallest pup's skull, intending to steer it gently toward the keep door. The pup turned its head and pressed harder into her palm, and the warmth that moved up her wrist was wrong in a way she had no name for. It ran up the inside of her arm and pooled somewhere behind her sternum, and the thing in her chest that had been locked shut for as long as she could remember gave a single, involuntary lurch. She pulled her hand back. The pup looked at her with its amber eyes, and the expression on a wolf's face can be difficult to read, but patience is not. She picked up her pail and walked to the gate. The pups followed. All 3 of them, in a row, paused silent over the gray glass of the courtyard, past the 2 gate guards who stared with their mouths open and said nothing. She heard the gate guard's sharp intake of breath. She heard the creak of the second guard's boot leather as he turned. She did not hear the third sound, the soft drop of a heavier foot hitting the ice, until the cold along the back of her neck changed in character. It was still cold. It was something else now, too. Aldrich of Harrow was 44 years old, scarred along the left jaw from a council ambush he had survived by luck and iron and very little else, and he had not run after anyone in 5 years. He was not running now. He was walking fast in a way that only looked like something else to observers who did not know him, and he was watching the 3 pups follow the scullery woman out the gate, with an expression his second Bren would later describe, in his private journal, as a man watching a wall crack. Senna heard his footfall on the ice. She stopped at the gate. She did not turn around. One of the gate guards found his voice. "My king, the pups have not been authorized to leave the inner yard. Shall I collect them?" "No," Aldrich said, and his voice arrived from somewhere very close behind her left shoulder. She felt it as a physical thing, a resonance in her back teeth. "Leave them." She turned then, because the alternative was to stand with her back to the King of Harrow like a woman who had forgotten her manners, and Senna had not forgotten anything. She looked at him straight, which was not what one did, which she did anyway. He was looking at the pups, and the crease between his brows said he was trying to solve an equation that was not cooperating. The pups were trying to climb her boots. "They have not done this before," he said. It was not addressed to her. It was addressed to the air. "I don't know why," she said, which was almost true. He looked at her then. Not at her station, not at her hands, not at the pails she was carrying, which was what people usually looked at when they looked at her at all. He looked at her face, and something in the set of his jaw shifted by a fraction, the way a beam shifts when the weight above it changes distribution. She had an absurd impulse to step back. She did not step back. "What is your name?" he said. "Senna. From the East Scullery." She paused. "The Dunfield tithe, my lord." Something moved behind his eyes very quickly. He looked back at the pups. "Take them inside when you are done with your work," he said, and walked back through the gate, and Bren was waiting just inside with his arms folded and an expression that gave nothing away, though his shoulders were doing something complicated. She stood in the cold with 3 wolf pups at her feet and the feeling behind her sternum that would not go back to sleep. And she thought, this is trouble. She was not wrong, but she did not yet know the shape of it. The first person to voice what everyone had seen was Lady Orveth, who held the Northern trade seat and had been angling a political alliance through her niece for 3 seasons. She said it at the mid-morning meal, in the upper hall, with 12 people at the table. "The Dunfield scullery woman has bewitched the pups," she said. "Someone with contacts in Dunfield should look into her lineage." The hall went quiet in the particular way it did when something true adjacent had been said in the wrong register. "She is an unranked Omega," said Cressland's factor, a narrow man named Poln. "The paperwork is clean." "Paperwork from Cressland's office," said Orveth, and smiled and said nothing further. Senna heard about this exchange from Mag, the cook who had given her the job of washing the good linens and, since decided Senna was worth keeping track of. Mag was broad and gray-haired and had opinions about 4 different kings. "Watch yourself," Mag told her, pressing bread into her hands before the evening service. "Orveth doesn't say a thing unless she's already decided it needs to be done." "I haven't done anything." "Doesn't matter." Mag said it with the flat kindness of someone who had learned not to waste warmth softening truth. "You're between her and what she wants. That's enough." Senna kept her head down. She worked. She carried the pups back inside the second morning when they tried to follow her again, placing each one carefully in the straw near the great hearth, but the smallest wriggled free before she reached the door and pressed its nose to her ankle with the conviction of a thing that has already reached its conclusion. She crouched and looked at it for a long moment. She had been told, when she was 8 years old, that her wolf had not come, that she was an Omega without the shift, without the bond, without the scent thread that linked a wolf to her pack. She had been told this by her mother in a voice scraped thin with worry, and by Dunfield's Alpha in a voice scraped flat with contempt, and she had believed it for 15 years because the evidence had been consistent. Nothing inside her moved when the moon pulled. Nothing answered when the pack howled at solstice. She was a woman-shaped gap in the bond chain, and she had organized her life accordingly. The warmth that came through the pup's fur was not nothing. She had no language for it yet, and she filed it beside the other things she had no language for, and went back to work. If you are watching this and you already know what that warmth means, stay. The knowing makes the waiting richer. The second time Senna came to Aldrich's direct attention, it was not because of the pups. It was because of the prisoner in the lower cell. Harrow Keep held, in its fourth subterranean level, a man named Galt, who had formerly served as the pack's bond keeper, the officer responsible for registering all mate bonds, offspring records, and lineage claims within Aldrich's territory. Galt had been discovered 6 weeks earlier to have been selling bond record alterations to Lord Creslin's office for 11 years. The alterations were of a specific kind, Omega lineage records, stripped of blood notation that would have elevated their station, made invisible in the register, made paperwork clean. Aldrich had placed him in the lower cell and had not yet decided what to do next, because the shape of the crime was still becoming clear, and Aldrich was a man who did not act until he understood the whole of what he was acting on. This was not patience. It was a kind of precision that had kept him alive through 3 assassination attempts and 1 full council coup, and he was not apologetic about it. Galt had developed a fever from the damp of the lower level. The Keep's healer, a man named Dort, had declined to attend him on grounds that bond keepers who sold lineage records did not deserve a warm compress, and Dort had other patients with better ethics. Bren had noted the refusal and said nothing, waiting to see if Aldrich would countermand it. Aldrich had not countermanded it. Senna heard the prisoner's fever coughing through the floor grate while she was cleaning the corridor that ran above the lower cells. She heard it for 3 mornings. On the 4th morning, she went down. She brought water and the willow bark she had been soaking since the 2nd morning, and the clean strips of linen she had cut from her own spare undershirt, and she crouched on the stone floor outside the cell bars and passed the cup through without touching Galt's hands, because she was not naive about prisoners. "Drink," she said. He was a thin man, 50 or so, with the yellowish cast that came from weeks without light. He looked at her for a long time before he reached for the cup. "You're not one of the healers," he said. "No." "Why are you here?" She thought about this. "Because you sounded like you were dying, and dying from fever is slow, and I had willow bark." He drank. She passed the 2nd cup. He was quiet while the willow bark worked, and she was quiet too, watching his color improve by fractions. After a while, he said, "You're from Dunfield." "Yes." "Who are your people?" "My mother was called Sarah. She died 4 years ago." Something happened to his face that was very carefully controlled. "Sarah of the Ashveld line," he said, and it was not a question. Senna went still. "I altered that record 11 years ago," Galt said, and his voice was the voice of a man who has been holding something heavy for a long time and has just put it down. "Creslin paid well. I did not ask what it covered. By the time I understood, the payments had become a habit." He looked at the cup in his hands. "Your mother was of the Ashveld blood. It is an old line, older than Harrow's treaty with the human settlements. It carries a primordial gift the histories call the first call. Wolves answer it before they are commanded to, the young ones especially. The pups, the warmth, the thing behind her sternum that had lurched awake and would not return to sleep. That is not possible," Senna said. "I have no wolf. I never shifted." "The gift suppresses the outward form," Galt said. "You would read as an unranked Omega to any standard assessment. That is why Creslin had the record altered." He paused. "There is a reversal, a ritual that removes the suppression. The old midwives of the Ashveld kept it. I don't know if anyone living still holds it. What she felt was not the feeling of a woman who had just received good news. It was the feeling of a woman walking a dark floor for years who has just found the wall she did not know was there, and the wall has a door. And the door is going to cost her everything she had organized herself around not having. She gathered her things and went back upstairs. She did not know that Bren had a habit of checking the lower cell each morning, and that on the morning she went down for the third time, Aldrich had come with him. They stood at the end of the corridor and did not announce themselves, and Aldrich watched the scullery woman from Dunfield sit cross-legged on the floor outside the cell of the man who had committed treason against his register, tending the man's fever with her own linen and her own bark. And the equation he had been trying to solve since the morning the pups followed her out the gate rearranged itself into something that had an answer. It was not the answer he was prepared for. The weight of it landed somewhere below his sternum and did not leave. He said nothing. He walked back upstairs. Bren walked beside him and also said nothing, which was one of the reasons Bren had held his position for 11 years. In the upper hall, 3 days later, the trap closed. Lady Orveth had been efficient. She had sent to Dunfield, and Dunfield's factor had sent back a document Cresslin's office had been prepared for years to produce. A lineage assessment stamped with the Harrow bondkeeper's official seal, which was Galt's seal, which was itself evidence of the crime, but could be read as evidence of the woman's undocumented status. The document stated, Senna of no registered line, unranked Omega, no bond gifts, no secondary bloodline notation. The document was a forgery built on a foundation of 11 years of paid alterations, and it was excellent. Orveth presented it in the upper hall during the morning meal, before witnesses, with Senna present because she had been sent to bring the tea service. In light of the confusion around the Dunfield woman's origins, Orveth said, with the careful warmth of a woman who had planned every word, I thought it best to clarify the record. The keep's own bondkeeper certified her status before his fall from position. She is exactly what the tithe roster says she is. She set the document on the table and folded her hands. I only mention it because there has been talk. The pups are young and impressionable. Not one face at the table looked at Senna. That was also a thing. The careful way powerful rooms did not look at the person being discussed. Poln, Cresslin's factor, added from the foot of the table, unranked omegas do not carry gifts. That is not ambiguity. That is biology. The woman should be returned to Dunfield if her presence is causing disruption. The room agreed with the gravity of rooms that have already made up their minds. She will be sent to Dunfield on the week's end, Poln said. Senna stood at the sideboard and kept her face neutral. She had learned to do this when she was very young. Behind her eyes she was calculating Galt's testimony, the Ashveld record, the name her mother had never said. The document on the table she knew was a forgery, and the one person who could prove it was sitting in a cell below the floor with a fever and crimes of his own. She poured the tea. Her hands were steady. The chair at the head of the table had not yet been addressed, because Aldrich had not yet entered the hall. When he did, the sound of him preceded him. Not footsteps, but the way the air organized, the way the guards at the door went a fraction straighter, the way the light from the fire seemed to weight itself differently. He came in from the side corridor, which was not his usual entrance, and he stopped when he saw the document on the table and Orveth's folded hands and the 12 faces arranged in consensus. He had been 3 steps behind this morning. He was not behind now. What is on the table? He said. Orveth explained. She did it well. She was a practiced political animal, and she knew how to dress coercion in the language of administrative clarity. She presented the document, the seal, the case, the solution. Her voice was smooth. Her argument was complete. Aldrich picked up the document and looked at it for a long time. Senna watched him from the sideboard. She watched him read it and turn it over, and she watched the stillness in his hands. And she understood something in that moment that she had not let herself understand before. He was not reading the document to evaluate its claim. He was reading it to find what was wrong with it, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that said he already knew. She had one move. She set down the tea service and said, "My Lord King, I would ask to speak." 12 faces turned. Orveth's composure flickered by 1/4 of 1 degree. Speaking uninvited in the upper hall was a violation of household protocol for someone of her rank. The violation itself was noted, logged in the register of small transgressions, and would cost her. She had calculated this. The cost of speaking was lower than the cost of Dunfield. Aldrich looked at her. "Speak," he said. "The document on the table was produced by a man currently in a cell below this floor for the crime of altering lineage records," Senna said. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "His seal does not certify my status. It confirms that he was willing to alter status records for coin, which is the same crime for which he is being held. I would ask that his testimony be taken before the document is treated as valid." The room was entirely quiet. Puln said, "An unranked Omega does not determine the evidentiary standards of the upper hall." "She is correct," Aldrich said. The silence changed shape. "The bondkeeper's seal is evidence in 2 directions," Aldrich continued. He set the document back on the table with the precision of a man returning something to its proper classification. "Bren, take 2 guards to the lower cell and bring Galt to the hall. Give him time to stand." He looked at Orveth. "We will hear the record." Orveth said nothing. She was very good at saying nothing when the board had shifted. They waited. The fire cracked and resettled. Someone poured tea. Senna remained standing at the sideboard because she had not been told to sit, and sitting without permission would have been a second violation, and she was not going to pay for infractions she had not chosen. The pups came through the side corridor first, which was not a thing anyone had planned. The smallest one went directly to Senna's feet and sat down with the decisiveness of a small creature who has settled a large question. The other 2 arranged themselves on either side. 12 faces watched this. The room's consensus began, very quietly, to change its mind. Galt came in between 2 guards. He looked better than he had in the cell, though not well. He stood in front of the table and Aldrich looked at him for a long time. "Tell the hall about the Ashveld record," Aldrich said. "All of it." Galt told it the way a man tells things when the last wall holding him up has come down. He named the dates, the amounts, the specific alterations, the nature of the Ashveld gift, the reason Kreslin had wanted it buried. 31 records altered across 11 years of quiet, steady payment. Senna was the last of them still inside Harrow's walls. The others had been dispersed to border settlements, assigned to trades that kept them from proximity to pack bonds, scattered like a man distributing kindling away from a fire. When he finished, the hall was silent in the way rooms go silent when the ground has changed. Puln stood. "This is the testimony of a confessed criminal. It cannot stand against an official document." "The official document was produced by the same criminal," Aldrich said. He stood, and the room stood with him in the automatic way of rooms that have never fully unlearned the response. "The woman stays. The document is void. Lord Kreslin's factor will accompany my second to review 12 years of Kreslin's tithe records." He looked at Puln. "You are relieved of your position pending that review." Puln went pale. "Senna." He said her name with the weight of a man who had been thinking about it for longer than 2 weeks. "Sit down." She sat. One of the pups climbed into her lap with the focused intention of a small wolf who has been waiting some time for the logistics to cooperate. 4 months passed. They passed the way time passes in a keep through the long dark of a brutal winter, slowly at the edges, quickly at the center, with many small moments that accumulated into something large. Senna was formally assigned to the Upper Keep Record Hall, which was Bren's suggestion and Aldrich's decision, framed as administrative, which fooled approximately no one. She had the archival skill that the hall needed. The transfer was defensible on its face. That she was now in regular proximity to the king's business, and sometimes to the king, was a fact about which no one spoke directly, least of all, the king. The intimacy of the record hall was a different thing from the intimacy of the courtyard or the upper hall. It was close and quiet and smelled of old parchment and candle fat. She worked across the table from Bren in the early morning, and sometimes, near the turn of the afternoon, Aldrich came in to review correspondence. He did not speak much. She did not speak much. The silence between them was not the silence of strangers. She learned that he was not cold. He was contained, the way heat is contained in stone that has been near fire. When he looked at a record he disagreed with, his hands went still on the table. She noticed these things the way she noticed all things, by watching carefully and saying nothing. The pups had been given access to the record hall as a matter of fact, and the smallest one had claimed a specific corner of Senna's skirt. Aldrich had looked at this on 3 separate occasions and each time looked away. Once she had glanced up at the exact wrong moment and caught the expression on his face before he could put it away, and her heart had done something she filed carefully under things she was not going to act on. One evening he stayed after Bren had gone. The fire was low. The parchment around them cast moving shadows. He was reading a document she had indexed, and she was copying a lineage correction from Galt's testimony, which was serving as the evidentiary basis for a wide reassessment of Cresslin's records. The work was slow and careful, and she had been at it for 9 weeks. "You could have said nothing in the hall," Aldrich said. He was not looking up from his document. "And gone back to Dunfield?" "Yes. That was not acceptable to me," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Why not?" She thought about how to answer this. She had been thinking about it, in various forms, since the morning the pup had first pressed into her palm and the locked thing in her chest had moved. She said, "Because what was in that document was a lie, and I knew it was a lie, and I was in a room with the authority to correct it." He set down his document. "That is not a small thing," he said, "to walk into a room full of people with more power than you and correct the record. It is when the cost of silence is higher." He looked at her then with the full weight of his attention, and the room got very quiet and the fire settled, and the smallest pup made a soft sound in the corner and went back to sleep. Senna held his gaze for 3 seconds and then looked down at her work. Because she was not going to be the one who said the next thing. Not yet. Not here. He did not say the next thing either. He picked up his document and went on reading. But the air in the room was different after, and they both knew it, and neither of them named it, and that not naming was its own kind of warmth. The old woman arrived in the 14th week of winter, when the frost had reached its deepest point and the dawn came the color of dirty iron. She gave her name at the gate as Maret of Ashveld, which was enough to stop the guard's pen on the entry form. She was perhaps 70, perhaps older, with the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting for something for a long time and has recently received word that the time has come. Bren told Aldrich before he told Senna. Aldrich told Senna himself. She came to the outer receiving room and found the old woman sitting with her hands folded on the table, and something in the old woman's face when she saw Senna was the expression of someone seeing a thing they had not allowed themselves to believe. "You look like your mother," Marit said. Senna sat down. The smallest pup pressed into her ankle under the table. Maret opened the box. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were a small iron vial, a length of cord braided from ash bark and something dark, and a thin folded paper whose creases had worn to near transparency. The Ashveld rite, she explained, had been held in the family's keeping since the gift was first recorded. The suppression was not natural, but a blood cost paid long ago to hide Ashveld children from a ruler who hunted them. It had come down the line as a perpetual silence in the wolf, and the ritual in the box was the thing that unmade it. The first shift, when the wolf has been held down for years, is not a gentle thing, Marit said. The ritual must be done inside a pack bond of sufficient strength. The wolf, when it wakes, needs something to reach for. Without that anchor, the first shift breaks, rather than remakes. She looked at Senna. I was told you are inside Harrow's bond. I am in the keep, Senna said carefully. The pack bond extends to those the Alpha has admitted, Marit said. Even if they do not shift, even if the wolf is silent, you are in it. That is why the pups can feel you. The confirmation arrived in Senna's chest like a stone dropped into cold water. She had been part of Harrow's bond for 4 months, inside the reach of Aldrich's pack. His authority, his recognition, and she had not known it. And either way, the fact was already a fact, independent of what either of them decided to say. What she had not accounted for was that Cresslin's factor, relieved of his post, had sent word to Dunfield. And Cresslin had sent men. They came on the 15th night of the 14th week, through the secondary supply gate. There were 7 of them, wolf-ranked, traveling in half-shift. Bren's night patrol found them at the east storage corridor, moving toward the record hall. The alarm went up. Senna heard the howl from 2 corridors away and was already moving. She was in the corridor outside the record hall when the first of Cresslin's men came around the corner, and she had 2 seconds to make a calculation she had not expected to make tonight. She did not run. She said in her clearest voice, I know why you are here, and I am telling you plainly that I will not go. If you are going to take me back to Dunfield, you will have to carry me. The lead man crossed the corridor in 4 steps. She threw the ink bottle at his face, which was not nothing, and then took the candle stand off the wall and held it across the entrance. He was a ranked wolf, and she was an omega with a candlestick, and the math was not good. The hallway went dark. Not completely. The dark came from behind Cresslin's man, where the air had changed the way it changed when something large and certain had entered a space and decided not to announce itself. Aldrich was in the corridor. He had come through the far entrance fast and without announcement, and the lead wolf turned and went still, with the automatic stillness of a wolf in the presence of something he could not outrank. The 6 behind him went still too. Aldrich looked at Senna. She was still holding the candle stand, ink on her hands. You are in Harrow, he said. You came through my supply gate uninvited. You came armed and in half-shift, and you moved toward a member of my household. His voice was not raised. It did not need to be. You have 30 seconds to explain this before I stop being curious about the explanation. The lead man tried. He cited Cresslin's authority, the tithe agreement, the voided document. He was running out of ground as he spoke, and he knew it. The 30 seconds passed. You will be confined until I send to Cresslin, Aldrich said. Take them. They were taken. Bren came and took the candle stand gently from Senna's hands, and she sat on the floor because sitting seemed like a reasonable response to a night like this. Senna felt, for the first time in a very long time, the full weight of what it meant to be fought for. Not rescued, not collected. Fought for, with a man deciding she was worth the consequence. Aldrich crouched in front of her. He did not offer his hand. He waited. The ritual, she said. Her voice came out even, which surprised her. Maret, there is a ritual. I know, he said. Bren told me. It requires a pack bond strong enough to hold the shift, he said. Then we know where to do it. He meant the hall, the great hall, where the full pack bond was anchored, where the assembly gathered. She looked at him. He looked at her. The candle between them was nearly burned down. If we do this in the hall, she said carefully, it is not a private thing. No, he said. You understand what happens if it works. What I would be. He said, I understand what you have always been. He said it the way a man says a thing he has been carrying for a long time and has decided to put down. The paperwork was wrong. The record was wrong. You are not wrong. He paused. I am not making a political decision. I want to be plain about that. The candle went out. They held the rite at dawn in the great hall, with the full assembly present, because Aldrich had summoned them, and when Aldrich summoned the assembly, they came. Marit stood at the center of the hall with her box and her cord and her vial, and Senna stood beside her in the plain gray dress she had been wearing for 4 years, and the assembly watched with the collective stillness of people who did not yet know what they were watching. Orveth was there. She stood in the second tier with her arms folded and her face giving nothing away. The pups were there, all 3 of them, pressed against Senna's ankles. Aldrich stood at the head of the room. Maret spoke the rite in old Ashveld syllables, the words worn smooth by generations of use, and poured the vial's contents across the cord, and tied the cord around Senna's wrist, and said the final words. For a moment nothing happened. The hall breathed. The fire in the great hearth leaned slightly sideways in a wind with no source. Then the warmth that Senna had been carrying, locked behind her sternum since the first morning the pup touched her palm, came loose all at once, and the thing it had been containing moved for the first time in 23 years, and the sound that came out of Senna was not a human sound. The shift took 7 minutes, which Marit would later say was fast, faster than she had expected, which meant the wolf had been pressing at the boundary for some time, and the boundary had been thinner than anyone knew. When it was over, the wolf standing in the center of the hall was not small. She was ash-gray and silver-tipped, and she was looking at the assembly with amber eyes that held the particular calm of a thing that has finally arrived where it was always going. The hall was very quiet. The pups went to her. All 3 of them, in a row, pressing their heads against her flanks, which was a pack behavior, a claiming behavior, a gesture that said in the body's language what the assembly had not yet found words for. Aldrich walked forward through the silent hall. He did not walk to the center the way a king walks to a political staging. He walked the way a man walks when he is not thinking about being watched, which was perhaps more honest than anything else about the morning. He stopped 2 steps from the great wolf that had been Senna, and he went down on one knee on the cold stone floor, and the hall went so still the fire's breath was audible. You are mine, he said, and the sentence was not a claim of ownership. It was a naming of fact, the kind of fact that the body knows first and the mind follows. You have been mine since the morning the pups chose, and I was 3 steps behind because I had not caught up. I have caught up. He pressed one open hand to the stone floor, palm up. The wolf that had been Senna lowered her great head and pressed her muzzle into his palm. The hall let out its breath as one, Orveth's arms uncrossed. It was a small thing, but the room noticed. What followed was not simple. Creslin's men in the cell were held while Aldrich sent inquiry to Creslin's seat. The review of his tithe records found irregularities reaching past lineage suppression into tribute fraud and bond record sales. Creslin was brought before the Greater Council in the spring and stripped. The hidden hand behind him, 3 northern lords funding the alterations to keep certain bloodlines from Harrow's walls, was named in the findings and sanctioned. Galt testified and received a commuted sentence. He was not forgiven. He was used, and he knew the difference. The 31 records were corrected. 26 of the people named in them were still living. Senna wrote the invitation letters herself, because she understood what it meant to receive news that rearranges the floor of everything you thought you were. Some returned. Others had organized lives elsewhere, and chose to stay in them, which was their right. Mag got a chair in the kitchen. It was given in autumn without ceremony, which was the way Mag preferred her gifts. Aldrich held his hand out differently, when she returned to her human form in the hours after the rite, standing in the great hall with the assembly still watching and the fire at her back. He held it out the way a man holds a thing he has already decided belongs to another person. She put her hand in his. The hall bowed. Some were slower than others, and the slower ones were those who had voted with Orveth's consensus that morning, but they bowed too, because the record was clear, and the record did not forgive you for being late to read it. There is a story they tell in Harrow Keep about the winter the wolves chose before their king did. They say the pups went first, and that the king was 3 steps behind, and that by the time he understood what he was running toward, he had already arrived. They say the woman he chose had been inside his bond for months without either of them naming it, the way a fire is inside a stone wall long before the stone shows warm to the touch. They say she had tended the prisoner and corrected the record, and held the candlestick in the corridor and told Creslin's men she would not go back, and that all of these things were the same thing, a woman who would not perform a self she did not have, even when the cost of being herself was very high. They say that is what the pups had known from the first morning, and what the king had known from 3 steps behind, and what the hierarchy had taken until winter's end to admit. The ash-gray wolf who walks beside the king when he tours the outer settlements does not appear in the old lineage records, because the old records were wrong. She is in the new ones, where she belongs. The entry is short. It says only what is true, and what is true is enough.